Hi, it's me, I'm Nafith. In this video, this is a continuation of previous videos about ClearPass, and in this specific part of the training, we'll talk about the ClearPass onboard. So ClearPass onboard, indeed, we will talk about what is onboarding in this case, and then after that, we'll talk about the certificate authority, a brief description, and then the onboard flow, how things work, onboarding steps, and we will talk about managing onboarding. Let's have a look. So the first question we need to ask, what is really onboarding? So people quite often mistaken the onboarding process with guest access. Sometimes they say we onboard just using the guest process, but the true definition of onboard, we are not equal to guest. Onboard relies on what's called certificate. So the concept here, someone we know, so it's a known user that is member of the corporation. They have an account in Active Directory. They bring their own device. So the actual onboard, sometimes we call BYOD, bring their own device. So that device we have no control over. But what we would like to have is basically a process we can secure that connection, because that user is a member of our corporate. That can be a cloud-based domain or an on-prem domain or LDAP or some sort of database. And the access control would be a certificate-based access control. On the other hand, the guest user is unknown to us. The user is unknown to us. Is somebody who probably a visitor, and they will create their own account most likely. And the device they have is also unknown device. We don't have any control over that device. And in this case, there's no certificate needed for that device, i.e. we will not deploy certificate for that guest access to take place. Obviously, we did talk about guest access in previous video. Guest access requires public certificate to be installed on both the NAT device, like the access point or the controller, as well as on the guest server, which is in this case the ClearPass. For the onboard, most likely we're going to use a certificate base, but that will be on-prem or private certificate. Now, because we are using certificates for the onboarding, we might have the user that might have multiple different machines, and both of them have been onboarded. So we push certificate to these machines, but now probably on one of these machines, for whatever reason, certificate has, or the machine has been compromised, or maybe the machine has been lost or something, we can revoke the certificate. So the same user now, we allow them to onboard on one device, but we revoked the onboarding by revoking the certificate that was pushed here on the other device. So we have a very much granular control, one-to-one control in this case. But what are the requirements for the onboarding? Broadly speaking, we need to provision an SSID that is kind of a captive portal. So when the user connects to that SSID, they will be redirected to a sort of a captive portal. And that can be the same captive portal for both guests and onboard with multiple links. Again, it depends on your design. Also, we need to have an onboarding server. So ClearPass is the onboarding server that requires a license. And the certificate then will be pushed to the device. In this case, it's going to be the SSL certificate. And we need to configure the authentication, or at least two authentication methods in this case. We will configure the certificate-based authentication that eventually will be the one that will be used after onboarding, which is EAP-TLS, as well as we will configure PEEP MSCHAP authentication method that relies or depends or uses username password. Obviously, as best practice, we would like to include the online certificate status protocol OCSP, or the older implementation of that one is certificate revocation list, CRL. So these are, broadly speaking, the main requirements. Now for that, we need to look at what is certificate authority. In a nutshell, it's a system, or we call sometimes PKI, public key infrastructure, that has a root, and that root will have intermediate certificate. And most likely, in the case of the ClearPass onboarding, maybe the intermediate certificate will be the one that is onboarding. But the trust chain will start from the root being trusted. Intermediate certificate, obviously trusted because we trust the root CA or certificate authority. Now remember, this issues the intermediate certificate CA, and then the onboarding one that will be the one that will be in direct interaction with the end device. So in this case, we will have to build our PKI. Now, if you deploy this one in a company, most likely you're going to integrate with an already deployed CA. So you might have your own CA, and then ClearPass will be intermediate. Or it could be the case that ClearPass itself is the root CA. So we have multiple options. An example of certificate authority you're building, so you go to onboarding, so you are in ClearPass onboard, and in the onboarding tab you click, the first thing you're going to do is create your own certificate authority, or you integrate this certificate authority as a member of an already existing, so that's going to be intermediate certificate authority. You fill out your details, and that will be the authority that will issue the certificates for the onboarding process. Of course, this means that we will need to have a license again, as we had mentioned. So what's the onboarding flow? So we have, we'll cover the SSID deployment options, single and dual, onboarding over the air, onboarding for the Apple iOS devices, Android devices, and Quick Connect. So just quickly, we will just look into these in a brief manner. So here we talk about the onboarding options. It can be single SSID. So the users come and connect with a secure single SSID. Is the same one they will connect, and initially they will use ePeep with MSCHAP authentication. So using the username password initially. They will go through the onboarding process, which we will explain a little bit later. Then after that, users after being onboarded will be disconnected. Now this is something that the user is oblivious to. They don't really know. After being onboarded, they will connect again and do the same secure SSID. Single SSID is the same one, but the method now in this case, after onboarding, will use certificate, and that means they are using APTLS. Compared to the before onboarding, they will use ePeep. Or if you decide to go with a dual SSID certificate, usually they will connect initially to an onboarding open SSID, or maybe enhanced open as we call it. So that SSID, in both cases, they will be redirected. So they will onboard, so the onboarding process will take place, and then after onboarding, the certificate, so the users will be disconnected, and then after onboarding, they will use APTLS. The eventual result or the end result will be the same. So they will connect to that secure SSID eventually, and then they will have the installed certificate on their own devices. So when they bring their own devices, and they will connect using that certificate. If you look at the onboard process, the steps, if you like, or the what happens really in this case, it depends on the device that you are onboarding. If you are using Apple, it depends also what version of Apple, not all of them, for the Mac OS after version 10.13, and you need to double check with ClearPass documentation. But we call this one over-the-air provisioning for Apple devices. So the iOS device comes here, they will connect, they will be redirected. CAFT portal will be the one that will be presented to them. They will start the onboarding process, and the difference is they will download, so they will log in the pre-provisioning step. They have to download and install the root certificate from the portal beforehand. So at this stage, you will notice that the Apple device will be presented with a login screen from that redirected page or the CAFT portal. They will provide the username password they use for Active Directory, for example. They will download the root certificate on the iOS device, in this case, and they will perform Apple over-the-air provisioning. So provisioning is completed now. So the device certificate will be deployed. They will be reconnected with EAP-TLS. Of course, they will go to the ClearPass policy manager. The ClearPass will, if everything worked as planned, they will authenticate them using the certificate. Of course, without needless to mention, ClearPass will need to be authenticated as well. So in this case, is a certificate used in both directions. If the success onboarded is completed. Something different happens for the Android devices. Android devices, they will normally use what's called Quick Connect. They don't have to pre-install the root certificate because Quick Connect onboarding app that will be used for both Android platform as well as Windows platform. In the Android case, they will have to go to the Google Play or the Android Marketplace. They will download the onboarding onboarding application, which is the Quick Connect, and that will enable them to onboard. Now, in both Android as well as Windows devices, they don't have to pre-install the root certificate that has signed the onboarding root certificate in this case. And what happens? The Quick Connect application itself will take care of that process, and it will take care of disconnecting and reconnecting the device into the onboarding SSID. So that's the Quick Connect app that will be used for both Windows as well as Android-based devices. The difference between these two is, in Windows case, the Quick Connect itself is part of the onboarding, is on the ClearPass itself. In the Android, we will allow users to connect to Google Play or Google Android Marketplace. They will download that application. But eventual result for both of them is the Quick Connect is responsible to either create a local profile on the machine that will be used for wireless communication for that SSID to you, and that profile dictates that we are going to use EAP-TLS for that process. So both of them the same. Quick Connect is in charge of downloading and installing root certificate as well as machine certificate at the same time. In the case of Apple, certain device type or models, they will be using over-the-air onboarding, and that will mean they will have to log in initially, download the root certificate, and then will continue the process for onboarding without having to use the Quick Connect. So there's no Quick Connect in the case of Android, case of Apple devices, and there is Quick Connect in the case of both Android-based devices as well as Windows-based devices. So what are the onboarding steps, if you like? Now, of course, we said we need to install or create the PKI, Certificate Authority, Public Key Infrastructure. We need to make sure that we have the correct license installed, and there will be three main, there are other settings as well, but there will be three main areas that will enable us to do the onboarding. Network settings, configuration profiles, and provisioning settings. So when it comes to licensing, we talk about the onboard license. You notice we are in the ClearPass Policy Manager under the Administration tab, Server Manager, Licensing. We have, of course, access license is needed anyway in all cases, and onboard license in this case. This is just an example of licenses being added to onboarding for onboarding process. Now, to access the onboard itself, so the process or the section in the application, you can either start from the login menu or the landing page, or this one, you can connect to the onboard from here, or when you log into ClearPass Policy Manager, you can, from the dashboard, you can go to the Quick Connect links that are available by default, and you can click on ClearPass, or you can go from the menu, click on these lines, click on the menu tab, and then go to the onboard. Once you are on the onboard, you see settings on the left hand side. So you are on the onboarding, and then we have sections here: configuration, deployment, provision, and provisioning. Now there are certain areas, of course, will be used for inside other areas. Like in this case, you configure network settings that will be used by the configuration profiles. You configure configuration profiles that will be used by provisioning settings. Anything to do with iOS, you do it from here. So some certain settings like applications and whatever details you'd like to include in the onboarded. So when the user onboard their own device or bring their own device, what happens, they might want to have the calendar with them. So when they onboard, they have their calendar ready, for example. And then here you define what Windows applications that might be included when the device has been onboarded. Again, this is to make it more convenient for those employees when they log into their own device. Still, we can allow them to access some resources. Depends on the policy of your corporate user. You start with network settings. So here, the main thing is basically is to define what is the name of the SSID and amongst other settings that will be used for the onboarding. So for example, here we can see an example that we are using the SSID name Wizlane employee. So we expect when someone connects and onboard, there will be a local profile created on the Windows or Android or whatever machine, and the name will be corresponding to Wizlane employee in this specific case. So whatever SSID that the users will end up connecting to after having EAP-TLS certificate provisioned, then that will be included in here. Now, of course, there are other tabs for other purposes, like what protocols you're going to use for Windows, for iOS, and so you define how things will be used. Like for Android, EAP is EAP-TLS. For Windows, EAP initially, EAP and so on. For Ubuntu, for iOS, and so on. And then you define what kind of authentication in the authentication tab. It's going to be certificate based. If it is Windows, you're going to be user as well as, of course, machine or device certificate. In the trust, you configure your trust relationship, what kind of .1x protocol supported in here. And for the, of course, in the trust, again, you define how, Android trust Windows and some other settings. And in the Windows, this is related to the Windows. What are the settings that you are enforcing in the onboarding? And if you are using any proxy in this case, that proxy, is it none? By default none, and normally we go none, or is it something that automatic? The device will have their own proxy, or something manually will configure the proxy settings for that specific device. When it comes to iOS settings, for example, in here you can specify certain parameters like what kind, when they onboard, what settings that will be included for the iOS devices. Likewise, when we think about Windows applications, what kind of applications you would like to include when the users log in and they bring their own devices. So what kind of applications that are ready to be used in this case. All of that we have been talking about the network settings. These are the settings that we talked about here, network settings. Next, we'll jump into the deployment and provisioning, and that will dictate some other settings to be used in this case. So the first thing, we will have configuration profiles. Remember, we have done network settings. We're going to use this one inside the configuration profile. The first thing we are going to do in the configuration profile is to define what kind of network will be included in this case. So notice in here, we're using the network settings that we have configured in the previous step. So network settings name is now visible here. Now, of course, there are some other settings within the provisioning settings That's the generic one or general one. There are other settings in the supported devices. So if you decide what kind of devices you are going to be able to provision, you might be restricting what provisioning devices. The web login page is the page that will be redirected to. So the users, when they connect and before the provision, they will be redirected to whatever page you have in here. Of course, if there are any special messages you need to send out to the users, and for the Apple profile, if you need to have any settings that relate to the Apple profile itself. And then on the onboard the client, what kind of device, what kind of logo. So for example, in the onboarding process, you might have your own logo. You might want to customize some other settings as well. And if there's any need, if you decide that you can only onboard or the devices can only onboard if they have been approved by a sponsor, you can enable sponsor approval as well. Of course, that requires integration because you need to send email, so you need to configure the SMTP settings for that purpose. Managing onboarding, we can look at the onboard device repository as the authentication source that we should use when you create the onboard service. You can look at the onboard devices, you can look at onboard users, and also we can include settings that will check the validity of the account as well as if the certificate has been revoked or still valid from that perspective by looking into or including OCSP in the authentication. If you look into the onboarding or onboarded device repository, you can clearly see that this is used as an authentication source. You can modify this, but at least you can clearly see built-in authentication source as the onboard device repository. So when they check part of that check on the authentication source, they will look at the onboard device repository. You can look at the onboarded users. So by looking into the onboard tab, management and control, view by username, you can allow, deny access to this user or allow access to this user. So you can control if you would like to deny access to all onboarded devices for that specific user, you can say, okay, deny. So now all devices for that specific user can be denied or allowed. Or if you would like, you can look at from the device perspective. The same user might have multiple devices and we allow them or allow that user to use some devices, others might be revoked, maybe lost or maybe stolen or maybe compromised as per your policy. Now, in the process of the onboarding, what we need in the in-service authorization, let us say the same user connects with the laptop, for example. They will check if certificate is valid, all good and nice, user exists in the AD and whatever department, and we will allow access. But later on, we might say this user has left the company, but the user does not exist in AD because we are able to check if the user account still exists in the AD by including some attributes. So we are able to see if the user account exists or doesn't exist, or the account exists but disabled. So we can look into these settings on the user account in the Active Directory and base our access control policy based on the status of that account. Example in here, we can check if the account has been disabled. If you look at the account status here, account status attribute, and we can include that account status attribute to make sure that we are able to check it. Also, not only the account, we can look into the actual certificate itself. So the certificate might look valid. ClearPass onboarding process will only be able to verify if the certificate is still valid or revoked by including the OCSP in the authentication. So in this case, EBTLS looks fine, certificate looks fine, but not yet revoked. We allow access. Assume certificate has been revoked. And if we don't include OCSP, we can't ask because we have not included then we will not be able to control access for those certificates if they have been revoked. So we have a lot of capabilities now. Once we include the OCSP, we are able to verify if the certificate has been revoked or not. Now, in your authentication method, you are going to say EP because that's going to be your initial authentication using EPIB username password, and then you will include EPTLS with OCSP. Of course, there are some details. It depends how many authentication authorities. You can copy this one and make a few changes, but the principle is to include OCSP with as the authentication method, as part of the authentication method. In the authentication source, you will, and again depends, like in this example, we have included the Active Directory, so they will check the account of the Active Directory username and the details of that account has been disabled or exists and so on. Of course, they will verify if the device has been onboarded. Thank you very much.